Tell us a little bit about Beale Street, driving around in Albuquerque and exploring the city centers, driving into Tulsa at noon on a Monday, people walking around with smiles on their faces. What are they looking for and why?
Well, I think that the fascinating, I lived in downtown Albuquerque, and the fascinating thing to me, it was exciting in some way because I would be walking, it could be like a Monday or Tuesday or whatever at like midnight. I could be walking home and it was exciting for me because you have to kind of guard yourself and be a presence to protect yourself and so I would be sensitive to the energy of this notion that the people on the street have this sort of collective energy about that relates to the safety of the street. And sometimes I would perceive that there was something like in the air more than others. And I think that there's a real truth to that, in that, sometimes somebody would come through Albuquerque and be a bad presence. They would go into coffee shops and ask people for money and then get upset with them if they didn't give them money inside a business establishment, for example, that type of circumstance. Now that person, if they're in that city for a week or 2 weeks, they've impacted a lot of those people that are on the streets. And so they've changed the energy of all of those people. And you can potentially read that these sort of changes that can happen. And then
Yeah.
there can be long-term changes in just an entire town. If an entire town is down and struggling, you could, I think, perceive to see that in the cash registers, the people's faces. And so when I got to contrasting Oklahoma City with Tulsa, when I got into Tulsa, it was very striking to me that it's like, wow, these people are walking the streets and they have smiles on their faces. So if I want to consider a city to tour in or to visit again or to potentially live in, and you can instantly drive in and recognize this aspect about it, then that's a powerful piece of information to try to extract kind of big picture thing about what's going on in that city and what that city's about.
And also it says something about you that you notice that they've got smiles on their faces, I think.
Yeah, observing people is really interesting to me. So I do self-identify as a psychologist.
I'm going to quote you now. You say on your website that magic is created when the locals congregate among the mixture of coffee shops, cleaners, record stores, dive bars, and empty storefronts.
Yeah.
What do you mean by magic here?
I mean, connections among people in the local community that leads to creative works, written words, art, music, things like the ones that we glamorize would be like Greenwich Village, where Bob Dylan and all of them got together and influenced each other and took the musical influences. Austin, probably like in the 60s and such. I'm not sure exactly when the magic early in Austin was happening, and in San Francisco with the Jack Kerouac and that group, Allen Ginsberg, the Beatniks and Big Sur area. That's magic when these influential people found a culture that actually depended on that culture, like maybe Bob Dylan and all those guys could have done something entirely different if they didn't find that community that they had that feedback communicative interaction with to come to where they were. And so it can't be too fancy, there has to be some conflict. In some sense, the art and the creative expression is solving some conflict. It can't be too clean. There should be some empty, struggling storefronts. The coffee shops can be halfway full, not overcrowded, and it's also filled with locals. it's not filled with tourists, because again, the locals are trying to build up and communicate and understand what's happening in their city. And potentially then once they understand what's happening in their city, then they can go in and affect and make changes about what's happening in their city. And sort of tourists kind of pollute that. And I think the locals intuitively know that. Again, like thinking of this notion of, you don't want like Greenwich Village or San Francisco today, which is sold on the story of the past. You want to find the places today that one day will become those places before anybody knows about it. And so the search for those places is what's super interesting to me.
Yeah, I had a friend who taught with regard to Nashville as the songwriting mecca compared to Glasgow, for example. His point was you'd be, you're better off in Glasgow than somewhere like Nashville, where it's all kind of happened. And it's finding the next place, isn't it? The next place where something might happen.
Yeah, that's why I kind of gravitated to Louisville and Charleston, West Virginia, is because when I went there seemed to be a need for that in the culture. You were fulfilling a need. You're not fulfilling any need if you go to Nashville. Like, they don't need you. That I got kicked out of the farmers market there. All I gotta say is that's the only place. Farmers markets are usually my favorite and the best places, but they asked me to leave. And it's
causing trouble.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's interesting.
I mean, I'm interested to know what you do. Were you stealing the apples?
Well, for busking, yeah, for playing music at the farmers market. Well, yeah, I don't know. I don't want to get off on a huge rant, but a part of the street performing is, again, the importance of socially recognizing things instead of making a blanket law or a blanket regulation that people just pass with and follow without thinking about the individual circumstances.
Yeah.
And so you have to really navigate the sort of details of each interaction on the street. And that, in a sense, these laws, it's like they hide from conflict. Like, we need to also be able to process conflict and deal with conflict and potential conflicts on the street and communicate about that. Communicate to others about how to better, be socially connected, and especially when we're distracted by this sort of artificial social world that's on our phones.
Episode 5 of Sam Lou Uncased, which is my new podcast series on contemporary songwriting practices and production, featuring DIY artists, informal conversations about what we do, how we find audiences, where we are when we sing, these kind of questions.